In this video, I'm going to tell you about what an escalation league can do for you when you're getting into the hobby. So last week, I did a video about skirmish games and why we're seeing so many skirmish games in the industry right now, why I prefer skirmish games, all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to go over all that right now, but but there are plenty of people that were in the comments and things like that who said, skirmish games are cool, or maybe they didn't like skirmish games, whichever, but they said, army games are really, for that person, where it's at. Now, if army games are really where it's at for you, that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But getting into an army game is, whether you want to get into it or not, like whether it's really your goal, it's still a pretty big hill to climb. It's tough to do because you're going from, let's say, 0 models to potentially dozens, if not 100 some models in a bigger kind of army style game. If you are building a game, let's say for one of the most popular ones out there, Warhammer 40,000, maybe you've heard of it. Generally people play at 2,000 points in that army size game, and going from 0 to 2,000, that's a big leap. So there's a concept that people came up with some time back to kind of help ease you into that big army style game that works for both people completely new to the hobby and also for people who have been in the hobby for a while but want to start a new army. When you sit down and decide, I want to start playing big army game X, whatever it is, or I decided I want an Adeptus Mechanicus army for Warhammer 40,000, and so now I need to figure out a 2,000 point list, start buying stuff, build, paint, all that kind of stuff. It can be difficult because even the people who are the most motivated can sit down and figure, okay, this is going to take me still maybe 6 months, because none of us, well, almost none of us do this as our day jobs. I certainly don't. So to sit down, if it is your day job, you can probably crank through a 2,000 point army pretty quickly. And certainly there are people out there who can do it very, very quickly. And you've seen probably videos like that where I'm going to paint an army in 24 hours and stuff like that. And that's super cool. But most people don't have that kind of time to put aside for that kind of thing. And so, it's going to take up some time. So how do you get around that? Well, as it turns out, you can't. You can't get around the fact that you need to, make this whole army happen. But you don't have to do it all at once, and that's where the Escalation League comes in. Escalation Leagues are frequently run by stores. So your local friendly local game store, will sometimes have an Escalation League for whatever kind of bigger army-style game that is popular at their store or that they're trying to sell more of, that kind of thing. And what it usually does is it breaks down, and you start out by building a small portion of the army. If, let's say, we're talking about 40K again, you usually are building to start like a quarter of that army. So about 500 points out of a 2,000 point army. That's the way that most escalation leagues for 40K at least seem to work, is you start out by building a 500 point army. You build it and paint it, and then you have a couple of games. It's a league, so what happens is it's not a tournament where you all play at once. It's like it depends on the store, it depends on the situation, sometimes between 2 weeks to a month to gather up the people that you're supposed to play against and play them so that you can then move on to the next step. Usually each segment goes up by about 250 points. So let's say in the first the first segment, I'm not even sure exactly what it's called in this situation or if there is a word for it, but in this first kind of session, you've got a 500 point list that you've got to work on, build, paint. And then sometimes you just have to play against somebody else in the group and it's up to you. Sometimes it's randomly chosen by the person who's running the league. But you have to play sometimes 1, 2, maybe as many as 4 different games against X amount of people, and you do it with that 500 point list. And they're doing the same. They're bringing their 500 point list, and it's a whole thing. And then after that's all done, now you have to start working on the next list, which is to expand that from, let's say in this situation, 500 to 750. Now, this is not NOM. There are rules. The rules frequently say that in a lot of situations, you can't bring really cool, named single characters into your first initial 500 point list. So you can't bring, Big Bobby G in as here's my 500 points or and there's frequently other rules like you can't bring in very large vehicles like an Imperial Knight, flyers, things like that. Generally, the way it works in most escalation leagues that I've seen is that first segment, that first chunk, you have to bring in at least an HQ unit and at least a couple of troops, which most people can do in their armies, and you get to build it and paint it and go from there. And then, now with 8th edition, you have all these different detachments. There's vanguards, there's scout, there's patrol, all this jazz. So you can kind of, depending on the people who are putting it together, you may have different detachment rules at each chunk, going from 500 to 750 to 1,000 to then 1,250 to 5,000, and you may not necessarily move completely all along where it's like every 250. As you get to say 1,500, maybe the list goes in and jumps next to 2,000. Many times, though, this does take, depending on the people and the group, it can take half a year. It can take a good 6 months to go from basically a 500 point list to a 1,000 point list. But if you're following those along, you're getting easily a dozen games in there as well with this new army as you're building it. And there's something that's really kind of smart about that. Besides the fact that the Escalation League is designed to, number one, get you to actually buy stuff at the store, because most Escalation Leagues, if they're run at a store, kind of require that you buy those models at the store. They're like, hey, it's not awesome if you go online and find these models for 25% off and then come and play at my store and use all my stuff and maybe win a prize. That's not cool. So generally you buy the stuff at the store. That's kind of point number one. But if you're in a club where there is no store involved, or you're just playing amongst your friends at a house, different story altogether. It's up to you. But one of the things it's designed to do is to get you to buy some stuff. Number two, it's to get you to actually build and paint the stuff, because the buying stuff, frankly, in a lot of situations is the easiest part. So getting you to actually build and paint is also, and keeping you motivated to do so and to keep doing so is also a big deal. But there's also something that's really smart about the way Escalation Leagues are worked, is that it's also teaching you about your army. And if you're brand new at the game, it's also teaching you about the game in small chunks as you expand. One of the other very difficult parts, frankly, of starting a new army-style game where you have a whole bunch of units, a whole bunch of models, a whole bunch of everything, is that when you decide, let's say you do sit down and you make that big hurdle and you build 2,000 points of Space Marines or whatever, and you get all that stuff, and then you go to your first game, it is drinking from the fire hose to figure out how the game works and all that kind of stuff, because you have so many models to keep track of. They have so many special rules. They have so many non-special rules, just regular rules. They have all this stuff, and it becomes incredibly overwhelming for a lot of new players to get into the big army game. Hence why I think a lot of people are kind of going to skirmish. But that's, again, different video. In this situation, when you start out with a small chunk, here is my 500 points, and it's just a few limited troop choices, and like I said, an HQ, maybe a couple of little things here and there. You can really focus on them and play, like I said, sometimes it's maybe just one, sometimes it's maybe 2 or 3 or 4 games in that chunk, and kind of get it under your belt. And by that last game in that chunk, you're starting to understand things. And there's nothing that says that you can't obviously play games outside the league. You could certainly use that same army to try some stuff out outside the league as well. But then when you move to 750, now you already know how to use this portion of it. And now you're just adding this kind of bit of a smaller portion, and you're learning about that. And it might teach you new rules in the system. It might teach you more, new rules that are just in this codex, that kind of stuff. And moving it along, kind of baby stepping it to get into the full-blown game is really a smart way to do it. So look around in your local area and see if any of your stores are doing escalation leagues, or if you've got groups and clubs, if those are the big popular thing where you are. Find out if any of those groups and clubs are doing escalation leagues. And if none of the stores and none of the groups and clubs are doing escalation leagues, go talk to your local store and see if they're interested in getting one started, and you can kind of help to spearhead it a little bit. If you are completely brand new to 40K or to whatever this big army game is in that situation, it might be Age of Sigmar, it might be War Machine, it might be all kinds of different games. You may need a little bit more help sometimes from the store owner or one of the store employees to kind of get things rolling. It's also a good idea, if you can, to get people into the league who are already playing that game, but they would just want to get into the league to start a new army, and they can kind of help as well. But if no one's running one in your local area, take up that flag and climb that hill, and you will find that if the hill's kind of slowly sloping as you go from 500 points to 750 to 1,000 and go forward, you're going to find it a lot easier to get to the top and to play a full-blown army game.
1, 2, 3, 4.